I'm under strict instructions from Lucy, our organizer, to start on time because we have so much to get through. So my name's John Reed, and it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to, as chair of the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, to welcome you all to our second international online conference. We have about 250 people signed up from 28 countries. Special welcome to anybody from New Zealand because it's 4 o'clock in the morning there. So well done you, Kia ora. Just very briefly about the Institute. We formed in 2017 as a group of international experts from over 15 countries, with a range of perspectives and types of knowledge, including personal experience, researchers, therapists, etc. And to put our work and the conference in context, we are literally talking about millions of people trying to come off or reduce their psychiatric medications around the world. Here in the UK, we now have 1 in 6 people, for instance, on antidepressants, and even higher rates for women, older people, and people living in deprived areas. And we know that about half, just over half of those will have some withdrawal effects when they try and come off, and half of those will describe them as severe. So it's a huge problem, and the Institute tries in its way to try and address the gaps, and the gaps are huge, particularly in knowledge about the withdrawal effects and also how to come off safely. So we'll be addressing some of those issues today and tomorrow. You'll be meeting fellow board members because each of the sessions is chaired by one of Olga, Ruth, Swapnil, and Stevie. So you'll be meeting all of my wonderful co-board members. And at this point, I need to say a huge thank you to Lucy Fernandez, without whom nothing would happen. We'd all just sit around talking about it. So thank you, Lucy, for all the work that you've done to bring us together again. A quick, I don't know what's the right word, disclaimer, perhaps the right word. We're not able in this context to give any personal or medical advice. It wouldn't be appropriate, and we're not trying to do that. So we will be answering broad questions about the issues of concern, but we cannot get into giving advice to individual people. I'm sorry if that's a disappointment, but that's just how it is. And I have one last thing to do before I hand over to Ruth and get the first session going. And this is a rather sad duty. We lost a very dear colleague a few days ago, Fernando Freitas from Brazil, who some of you will know, some of you will have been very close friends and colleagues with him. He contracted cancer about 4 or 5 months ago and died really quickly, and it was a shock to all of us. He was a very, very warm, bubbly, delightful and person and determined campaigner for the rights of people with mental health difficulties and that sort of issues we're concerned about. So on behalf of the board, I'm just gonna dedicate the next 2 days to Fernando, and we will be thinking about him. Okay, so welcome again, and over to you, Ruth, to
hey, thanks.
First session.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everyone. So I'm Ruth, and I'm one of the board members of the IIPDW. I work at King's College London as a research associate. And I'm just introducing Joanna and Mark's talk, which is they're going to be discussing our paper, which was published last year, which showed that people with depression do not have a chemical imbalance. So Mark Horowitz is a training psychiatrist and a researcher in the NHS and at UCL. And Professor Joanna Moncrieff is a professor of critical and social psychiatry at UCL and also a consultant psychiatrist in the NHS in London. And there will be 15 minutes at the end for audience questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box so we can see them more easily. Yeah, that's all really. So Mark, Joanna, do you want to press ahead?
Yes, thank you, Ruth. That's lovely. So I'm going to go first. and talk a little bit about the history of the whole chemical imbalance idea. I thought it would be interesting, and it turns out to be actually very relevant to the whole question of withdrawal. And then Mark is going to cover some of the reactions to our paper, which also might be of interest. So I shall share my slides. Sorry, Mark, did you want to say anything else while we're starting?
No, take it away.
So can you see those all right?
Yes.
Yep. Does it move?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So yes, I have referred to the chemical imbalance theory as modern psychiatry's foundation myth, if you can see that, because I do think that it is one of the foundational ideas, and I think that's why challenging it has proved so aggravating to much of the psychiatric establishment, as you will see. So why is it important? I think it's important because it's a shorthand for the idea that drugs are targeting an underlying brain abnormality, and therefore that mental disorders can be thought of, that mental disorders are brain disorders and can be thought of or qualify as medical conditions. It's also a way of differentiating prescribed drugs from recreational drugs. And it also embodies the idea that prescribed drugs are work by targeting underlying diseases or mechanisms that produce symptoms in the same way that most other medical drugs do. In other words, it represents what we might call a disease-centered model of drug action, for those who know my work on drug action, which I will refer to briefly again later, but I'm not going to go into in great detail. But that is essentially the disease-centered model, the idea that drugs work by targeting an underlying abnormality that produces the symptoms. And Wayne Goodman, an academic psychiatrist from the US who was chair of the FDA's Psychopharmacological Committee in the noughties, put it like this. He said the idea of a chemical imbalance is a reasonable shorthand to convey the idea that depression is a chemically or brain-based problem and that medicines are normalizing function. So I think that sums up what the chemical imbalance idea stands for and why it's important. How does it relate to questions of dependence and withdrawal? Well, it's not completely incompatible. You could have an idea that drugs are targeting underlying mechanisms of depression and also accept that they are changing the brain through other mechanisms that might lead to dependence or that might lead to physical dependence. But it certainly focuses attention away from that and onto the theoretical underlying abnormality. So it diverts attention from the fact that these drugs are changing the normal state of the brain. And it's these changes or adaptations, as they're often referred to, that underpin physical dependence. The other reason it's relevant, as we will see, is it was used to neutralize the damage done to the reputation of psychiatric drugs by the discovery that benzodiazepines were addictive or dependence forming in the 1970s and 80s. So what is the history of this idea of the chemical imbalance hypothesis or theory of depression and other mental disorders? Well, these sort of neurochemical theories about the causation of mental health problems start to emerge in the 1960s. The specific one related to depression is often referred to as the monoamine hypothesis of depression, and it's an idea that proposes that serotonin or noradrenaline abnormalities, those are both brain chemicals, are the basis of depression, particularly that depression was caused by low levels or low activity of one of these brain chemicals. And the other context that's important, the context of this new idea is important. And part of the context is the introduction is the fact that this was the period in which a new range of drugs were being introduced for the treatment of mental health problems. And they were new drugs that sparked a lot of interest and enthusiasm. They started with drugs that we now refer to as antipsychotics, like chlorpromazine, but then rapidly following that, there was the introduction of drugs that came to be seen as antidepressants. The other bit of context that's very important is that this was the period at which the recreational drug scene was getting going. And this scene really got started with the diversion of prescription drugs, particularly amphetamines and barbiturates. I didn't realize this until I started reading more into this period, but this, the use of diverted prescription drugs predates the special manufacture and distribution or importation on a large scale of recreational drugs. This is a picture of Purple Hearts, which were a mixture of amphetamine and a barbiturate, and were obviously popular among mods and rockers in the 50s and 60s. So during the 1970s and 80s, however, the pharmaceutical industry were not much interested in this idea of the chemical imbalance. They were busy selling benzodiazepines mostly, and before that barbiturates for the treatment of anxiety. And at this time, this really didn't require a chemical imbalance narrative. It was obvious what these drugs did. Many people quite enjoyed their effects, and it was quite easy to carve out a market for them. But the monoamine hypothesis of depression remained important to the psychiatric profession, particularly as it tried to move away from psychoanalysis and social psychiatry that had dominated psychiatry to some extent, at least in the US, in the middle part of the 20th century. Psychoanalysis, of course, was always tied to a concept of neurosis or anxiety. And so the profession, as it moved away from that, was trying to focus more on depression. In the 1980s, the National Institute of Mental Health commissioned a big project called to look at the psychobiology of depression. And one of the remits of this project was to test the monoamine hypothesis, to look for abnormalities in serotonin or depression. And a lot of money was invested into this project, and basically it looks as if it found nothing. There are not even that many publications on it, and the ones that exist don't document any real abnormalities that they found. So by 1987, David Healy wrote an early paper describing the monoamine theory of depression as a failed Kuhnian paradigm, referring to Kuhn, the philosopher of science. However, trouble was brewing with the existing paradigm, with a paradigm that was being used to market benzodiazepines. Trouble that was in the form of the massive scale of use and emerging information, emerging data about their ability to cause dependence. So by 1971, 20% of women and 8% of men in the US were prescribed a benzodiazepine, half of them using them regularly. In the 1980s, a television program did a poll in the UK and found that 23% of the UK population were using a benzodiazepine. In the late 1970s, several well-known figures came forward to say that they had become dependent on benzodiazepines. One of the most famous of these was Betty Ford, President Ford's wife. And after the publicity that she gained for her problems, she was, interviewed in various television programs and was very public about her difficulties, a senatorial committee was set up to investigate the problem of dependence caused by benzodiazepines, headed by Edward Kennedy, so a serious committee. At that committee, Hoffman LaRoche, who were the makers of Valium, diazepam, argued that addiction was very rare at therapeutic doses, so that these people who were describing addiction, describing dependence, were basically people who were misusing the drugs. On the other hand, several doctors who'd become dependent testified that they'd become dependent, and they'd become dependent on therapeutic doses. They hadn't been misusing them in any way. So that was happening in the US. In the UK in the early 80s, a famous consumer program called That's Life ran 2 programs on benzodiazepine dependence, at which many people came forward to describe the difficulties they'd had trying to get off these drugs. And this really, the combination of this publicity in the States and in the UK and Europe really established that benzodiazepines were dependence-forming drugs. It was accepted against Hoffman-LaRoche's protestations that they could cause dependence at therapeutic doses. And by the mid-1980s, anti-anxiety drugs had become unsaleable. A company tried to sell Busparone for anxiety and tried to persuade people it was non-addictive, and people no longer believed this narrative, no longer believed that you could have a drug for anxiety that would not be dependence forming. Because of course, this revelation about benzodiazepines follows revelations about the barbiturates, that they were highly dependent, and it followed arguments made when the benzodiazepines were introduced that they would be a non-addictive alternative to benzodiazepines. So no one was going to believe this anymore about anti-anxiety drugs. So that is the context into which the new antidepressants, the SSRIs, are introduced in the late 1980s. So the first one of these, Prozac, was actually developed in 1972. The initial paper on it describes how it was deliberately developed to be a drug that blocked serotonin reuptake and therefore increased the availability of serotonin in nerve synapses, in the gaps between nerve cells, and therefore it was proposed would enhance serotonin activity. And it was proposed in that paper that it may be useful as an antidepressant because the monoamine hypothesis and the serotonin hypothesis were already current at that time, but nothing was done to bring it to market until the 1980s. So it wasn't launched until 1987, I think reflecting the fact that, as I said, that the market at that time was dominated by the sale of benzodiazepines. But when it was launched, it was almost immediately a massive success and cultural phenomena. There was a rapid escalation in sales. By 1990, it had already featured on the front page of several leading magazines. This famous article by Newsweek, for example, was published in 1990. It was voted as Fortune magazine's Drug of the Year in 1990. I didn't know there was such a thing. And by 1994, it was the highest selling drug in both the US and worldwide. Sorry, the second highest selling drug after Zantac, the antacid. It became, as I said, something of a cultural celebrity in its own right. Sorry, I'm just trying to, I can't even read that properly. So serotonin becomes a minor celebrity, according to David Hertzberg, who wrote this really interesting book called Happy Pills. So Time magazine is talking about, could a single brain chemical hold the key to happiness, high social status, and a nice flat stomach? That's right, weight loss. And Oliver James in the UK in The Guardian speculates whether the British have become a low serotonin people. Does that explain why we're so depressed all the time? And the idea that this drug was treating a chemical imbalance was integral to its promotion and marketing right from the start. So Elliot Wallenstein, in his book Blaming the Brain, has recorded a few examples, early examples of this. So an Eli Lilly pamphlet describes how serotonin, an important chemical found in the brain, is linked to depression. And then, of course, in 1997, the FDA in the United States relaxed the restrictions on direct-to-consumer advertising. So it becomes legal to advertise pharmaceuticals on the television, in magazines and newspapers. In fact, there was some loopholes that enabled that before then, but it starts to be very widely done from this time onwards. So this is a quote from Cosmopolitan magazine in 1997, which is clearly using this idea of low serotonin to justify the use of Prozac. When you're clinically depressed, one thing that can happen is your level of serotonin may drop, and to help this, to bring serotonin levels closer to normal, the medicine doctors now prescribe most often is Prozac. Bestsellers were written about Prozac. Elizabeth Wurtzel described her experience of depression and response to Prozac, although it doesn't last that long. Listening to Prozac is written by the psychiatrist Peter Kramer, who describes its miraculous effects on some of his patients. As if the pharmaceutical industry weren't doing well enough on their own, the psychiatric profession weigh in to run these depression awareness campaigns to raise awareness of depression and basically increase the sale of antidepressants. So the National Institute of Mental Health in the US run a depression awareness campaign that starts in 1988 and has this message: depression is common, serious and treatable. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? I can't find whether this was funded by a pharmaceutical, had any funding from the pharmaceutical industry. So if anyone else can, let me know. But it comes out in 1988, a year after Prozac. It seems like a strange coincidence if it wasn't. The National Alliance for Research on Schizophrenia and Depression definitely did get funding from Wyeth Ayerst at some point, and they also ran a campaign, Depression, a Flaw in Chemistry, Not Character, in which they very explicitly refer to the idea of the chemical imbalance. And then, of course, in the UK, the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the Royal College of GPs get together to run something called the Defeat Depression campaign, which is launched in 1992. This is one of the pamphlets that it produced. And one of its messages, one of its explicit aims was to wear down people's natural resistance to taking drugs to manage emotional problems. So in 1996, a paper about the market research that they did for the campaign is published in the British Medical Journal. And they talk about how they find that there is a strange resistance to taking drugs for depression. And preliminary research revealed that most participants thought that drug treatment for depression was potentially addictive and dulled the symptoms rather than solving the problem. And most people thought that depression was caused by divorce, unemployment, and other problems. So obviously, the public needs far more education and persuasion in the taking of antidepressants when they are needed. This is more information from that campaign, courtesy of, I can't remember his name, someone who runs a good website who's kept together some snippets. So apparently, the public need to be taught a great deal more about the safety and effectiveness of antidepressants. And Princess Diana, who should have been better advised, recently lumped together tranquilizers, sleeping tablets, and antidepressants as drugs causing subservience to their lot in life and dependency, especially in women. It needs apparently to be shouted again and again from the housetops: antidepressants are not addictive. I want to just mention, I don't know if Mark's listening now, I just want to mention something about this word addictive. So I know that, that Mark and other people want to save the word addiction to refer to situations where drugs cause effects that people might seek, so that might cause craving or drug-seeking behavior, and save dependence for situations where the body has adapted and there's a physiological dependent situation. But I think here you can see why this distinction is a bit problematic. Addiction to most people means that you need something, and if your body has become physiologically dependent, you need it. And when they are saying it's not addictive, they might have defended themselves by saying, well, there might be some physiological dependence, but people don't go off seeking them. But most people would understand that as meaning they are not like benzodiazepines. They do not make you physically dependent. Anyway, all these efforts were enormously successful, and the use of antidepressants took off big time over the course of the 1990s and subsequently. And everything was going swimmingly until a paper was published in 2005 by two American academics, Jeffrey Lacasse and Jonathan Leo, who wrote this little paper which was published in PLOS Medicine. That is significant because PLOS Medicine was started up by Richard Smith, who was the editor of the British Medical Journal, who was a ardent campaigner against the influence of the pharmaceutical industry on medicine. So this paper was published in this journal that he set up, and basically this paper showed that that although the advertisements were talking about the role of serotonin, low serotonin in depression and chemical imbalances and abnormalities, actually they couldn't find any leading scientists or researchers who would actually support this point of view, and there were plenty of people who were actually saying actually there isn't any evidence for it. So the psychiatric establishment had to respond to this, and this is when they start to become a little bit defensive. And Wayne Goodman, who I quoted at the beginning, admitted that the evidence for the serotonin hypothesis was elusive, but as I said earlier, that it was still, the chemical imbalance was still a useful metaphor for this idea that depression is a chemically or brain-based problem and that the medications are normalizing function. The implication of which was that this simply must be true. It seems that Wayne Goodman couldn't countenance that there might be any alternative way of thinking about depression or of what medications might be doing to someone who was depressed or not depressed. Then Ronald Pease, leading psychiatric academic in the States, also the editor of the Psychiatric Times, which is a widely read psychiatric trade magazine essentially in the US. He responded in the same sort of way to a pamphlet that was produced by CCHR, the Scientology organization, which was put out, which I can't find anymore, must have been put out around 2010, 2011, claiming that the chemical imbalance idea was not supported and that psychiatrists were therefore putting across an unsupported, non-evidence-based idea. So he wrote 2 blogs in 2011 to protest against this pamphlet. He said, nothing has made him more angry than this idea being put across that psychiatrists think all mental disorders are due to a chemical imbalance. In the past 30 years, I don't believe I have ever heard a knowledgeable, well-trained psychiatrist make such a preposterous claim, except perhaps to mock it, he said. And he went on, in truth, the chemical imbalance notion was always a kind of urban legend, never seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists, and should be consigned to the dustbin of ill-informed and malicious caricatures. He was obviously bombarded by messages from people saying they had indeed been told by their psychiatrist that they had a chemical imbalance and that depression was a chemical imbalance. So his second blog is a response to one lady who wrote in this, but I suspect many more. So in which he admits that some doctors do tell people that they have a chemical imbalance because they think it's good for the patient. It might make them feel less blameworthy because it provides a kind of explanation. But really they know it's an oversimplification, and people who, the psychiatrists who use this expression, feel a bit uncomfortable and embarrassed when they do so. On the other hand, he claims in this blog that although no one really believes the crude chemical imbalance hypothesis, there is a holistic biogenic amine hypothesis, which is a very good hypothesis. And this is different because this hypothesis admits that although depression may be partially caused by biochemical abnormalities, of course, other things, it allows for the influence of other factors. But he feels that this has unfortunately been twisted into the chemical imbalance theory by some pharmaceutical marketers and misinformed doctors. And then, rather amusingly, in 2015, Leo and Lacasse write another paper on this, and there's a response to their paper by Ronald Pease and by Daniel Carlat, a psychiatrist who, and so Ronald Pease is once again saying that no general theory of a chemical imbalance has been propounded by academic psychiatrists or official psychiatric organizations, except that some people may have used the unfortunate expression, the unfortunate shorthand expression of the chemical imbalance. And rather embarrassingly, Daniel Carlat in his commentary says, well, if a patient asks me how medication works, I say, yes, well, we're not sure, but we think it's got something to do with increasing levels of neurotransmitters and rebalancing certain chemicals in the brain. So the sort of high profile psychiatrist that he's paired up with to do the commentary makes it exactly the shorthand and unfortunate expression that Pease is saying only a few physicians do. So we did a short paper on, probably quite a long paper, to look at to what extent the chemical imbalance hypothesis had been endorsed by academic psychiatry and official psychiatry, establishment psychiatry, over the 20 years leading up to those blogs by Ronald Pease, which was published just before our main serotonin paper. And we basically looked at highly cited papers on the etiology of depression. We looked at we looked at papers on the neurobiology of depression, and we searched for papers that were specifically about serotonin, and we looked at textbooks of psychiatry. And we found basically that papers on the etiology of depression frequently referred to the serotonin hypothesis of depression and referred to it as being supported by overwhelming evidence or substantial indirect evidence, as being well established. The papers that we identified on depression, on serotonin itself, first of all, were very, very highly cited papers. So this just shows this was an area of research that was stimulating a lot of interest at that time. And again, these were all saying that the role of serotonin is generally acknowledged, of special importance, supported by abundant evidence, a textbook truism, one even referred to it as. Textbooks also were referring to this idea as, we're also referring to the serotonin theory of depression as being supported, but often qualifying that sometimes, and sometimes saying quite contradictory things on the same page, even, as, for example, in this New Oxford textbook of psychiatry published in 2009, where they start off by saying the monoamine theory is at best a theory of drug action, that no abnormalities produced by the illness have been proved. But then they say that tryptophan depletion studies provide evidence that 5-HT is intimately involved in mood disorder and other things, other similar statements. So it's almost as if the qualifying statements enable the theory to persist by saying, oh yes, well, we know that the evidence isn't that consistent. Psychiatrists then can then go on and just accept the theory because they've done their bit. They've acknowledged the equivocal nature of the evidence. And this very much seems to persist in recent times. This is a 2020 paper about the role of serotonin in mood, learning, and social cognition. And it admits in numerous different places that basically there is that the evidence is highly contradictory, and it is impossible to even describe a unified functional theory of 5-HT, of serotonin. But nevertheless, it talks about how, you know, if we just could understand a bit more about the serotonin subtype receptors, this offers promising directions for drug development, and is basically, you know, just a little bit more research into this will enable us to understand how serotonin modulates behavior. So the search for the elusive material substrate of mood disorders and mental disorders can continue as before, as David Cohen and Shannon Hughes said. So just got a few minutes then on our paper. And so we did a systematic umbrella review looking at all the evidence for serotonin and depression. And we got together evidence from the main areas of research that have tried to look at this. They consisted of these different areas, looking at serotonin in body fluids, the serotonin metabolite in the fluid around the brain, the CSF, serotonin receptors, some gene studies. And we found 17 meta-analyses across all these different areas, involving almost 6,000 people for the non-genetic studies and way over 100,000 for the genetic studies, which were very large. And basically, we found no evidence from any area that depression is associated with lower serotonin concentrations or activity. There was a little bit of evidence from some areas, the receptors and the CERT studies, that it might be associated with higher levels of serotonin, but the evidence was inconsistent and the results are very likely to be false positives or due to the consequences of antidepressant use, because most of the people in these studies had used antidepressants at some point. There was some evidence that taking antidepressants was associated with lowered serotonin activity in the long term. That was coming from serotonin studies and the metabolite studies, and may also explain some of the other findings. And the genetic studies, it's always very difficult to prove a negative, but the genetic studies were very convincingly negative. They were very large, and some of the later studies were very well conducted. And they also, interestingly, showed strong associations. They showed no effect of the gene for the serotonin transporter, and no effect of an interaction between the gene and adverse life events, but they did show a very strong effect of adverse life events on people's subsequent vulnerability to experiencing depression, which is supported by a lot of other empirical evidence. So what are the implications for antidepressants? Well, basically it means that we can't say antidepressants are reversing an underlying brain abnormality or targeting an underlying biological mechanism producing depression. There may indeed be other biological mechanisms that we haven't found apart from serotonin, but these have not been established either. And therefore, we have to consider other possible ways that antidepressants might be having their effects. And this is where these two models of drug action come into play. So what I'm saying is that we need to consider that drugs may act in a drug-centered way rather than this disease-centered way of targeting an underlying abnormality. And the drug-centered model suggests that psychiatric drugs are psychoactive drugs that change the normal state of the body and brain, and that these changes are manifest in changes in people's sensation, sensitivity, mental activity, behavior, and physical functioning. And that these changes can temporarily override mental distress or other unwanted or abnormal mental states or behaviors. These changes are what cause dependence and withdrawal, and they also are responsible for predictable and unpredictable harmful effects of long-term use. So I think I've gone on for long enough. So Mark, do you want to take over and just share the reactions to our paper, which I think just bring us back to this idea of why the chemical imbalance theory has been so important to mainstream psychiatry?
All right. Okay. I'll just talk for a few minutes so there's enough time for a few questions. So thank you at the beginning, Ruth's nice introduction. I'm Mark Horowitz. I'm going to present some slides I hope can be seen. I'm going to try to do this. Okay, so people may not have followed it as closely as me and Joanna did, but after our paper was published, there was a lot of responses in academic literature, in the media, on Twitter. And so I just want to quickly summarize what happened. And I think it sort of shows the cultural story that Joanna's just told manifested in all these responses. So you can see it happening in live. So I want to start with a story from Freud. In one of Freud's works, he relates the story of a man who was accused by his neighbor of having returned a kettle in damaged condition. And the three arguments or excuses he offers: that he had returned the kettle undamaged, that it was already damaged when he borrowed it, and that he never borrowed it in the first place. And in the same way that these explanations are internally contradictory, we had a bit of a broken kettle story with the response to our paper. So the most, I should say, the context, as Joanna's laid it out, is in surveys of the public, 85 to 90% of people believe that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance. Of course, many people have been told it by their GPs or psychiatrists. And even today, this explanation still features in patient information leaflets. I've got a bottle of escitalopram in my house. It currently says that antidepressants affect serotonin, which cause depression. So it's not historical, it exists today. It's on medical websites. It's still on the official Australian psychiatry website, and it's still present in some parts of the official American psychiatric website. So this was the response. The most common response to our paper was, we long ago gave up on this idea. This is not news to us. So in a particularly blistering response in the Rolling Stone, one psychiatrist from America said, it's a quaint and oversimplified shorthand. It's been superseded by other explanations. This paper was met with yawns by the psychiatric community. And the next thing that I'll tackle is discrediting the black bile theory of depression from antiquity. And they would never say such a thing, very much reflecting what Ronald Pies has said in the past. This theory hadn't been held widely by the mental health community for some time. That was in Vice. And in another story, to me, this is an old theory for depression. It was invalidated 20 years ago. So we're just essentially putting the nail in the coffin, so to speak. And at the same time, it's probably still true, and we just need to look harder. So these are two responses from British psychiatrists. One of them says it would be too premature to dismiss the serotonin hypothesis of depression at this point. What we need to do is have better studies that look more carefully in the brain and not look at indirect studies. Another psychiatrist said similar things. about the serotonin system, it would be surprising if such a widely distributed brain neuromodulatory system was completely uninvolved in the complex experience that make up clinical depression. So they never believed it, and it's still true. And if it's not true, we have other theories. This reminds me of a Groucho Marx quote, those are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others. For example, a professor of psychiatry in America talked about it's not serotonin. We haven't thought it's a chemical imbalance for a long time. It may be because antidepressants cause the growth of new neurons or certain chemicals that cause growth. And as Joanna mentioned, there are many theories in the literature about how antidepressants might work, relating to inflammation, effects on positive or negative bias, the growth of new brain cells, growth factors. A lot of these are based on animal studies. Some of them may indicate the opposite of benefit. I just want to point this out because it's such a prevalent theory out there, this growth of new brain cells. There are lots of things that can cause the growth of new brain cells in animal models. For example, strokes, where you cut off the blood supply to the brain, or blunt trauma will cause the growth of new brain cells in an animal as a response to injury, in the same way new skin cells grow when skin is damaged. And so the growth of new neurons may not necessarily be a beneficial effect. It may be evidence of damage with a response from the brain. So in any case, these explanations have not been substantiated in humans. It was just a slight miscommunication was another variation on this. One psychiatrist bemoaning that the psychiatrist hadn't communicated to the public well enough, and that was all that was missing. And then in every piece of messaging, just a couple of minutes here, there was underlining the fact that antidepressants still work. Whatever has changed about the explanations, the punchline was the drugs still work. This is a New York Times article with the subheading, the most commonly prescribed medications for depression are somewhat effective, but not because they correct a chemical imbalance. A professor of psychiatry was interviewed in the middle and said, he was asked, do these drugs work? And he said, I think they do. The best clinical trials and meta-analyses, most of them indicate that there's some medication effect. I would say it's less than we would like it to be. And then the New York Times journalist really jumps in for him and says, but to psychiatrists who prescribe these drugs, the reality is that while the medications are imperfect, they do help the majority of people who take them. A position not supported by the literature so far. I won't go into this. This psychiatrist says antidepressants and placebo are barely distinguishable, but when you give antidepressants, you get the placebo effect. It's unethical to give placebo, so we should still keep giving antidepressants. And the last thing, when you always, I think this was a sign of gutter journalism at its worst. If you're not winning an argument, go for the person, not the argument. And in Rolling Stone, which I had thought as a younger man was quite a cool magazine, put our paper, our academic paper in molecular psychiatry associated with right-wing figures. So here is Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene, far right-wing voices in America, and put our paper in the basket with them. Slightly amusing, because just a couple of months before, Joanna published a Marxist analysis of the political economy of the mental health system. So slightly peculiar right-winger. They went for the lowest of the low, the old, perhaps she's a Scientologist, and then outlined a number of things that she didn't say in a very sensationalist, extreme, radical way. And then finally, The Guardian came out to say that antidepressants do work, with professors in Britain saying the clinical benefits are now beyond a reasonable doubt. And then the last point they made was the drugs do not work just by numbing emotions. This was an article in The Guardian trying to dispel misinformation about antidepressants, one of them being that antidepressants simply numb emotions. This said they do not. In in the Psychiatric Times, a more academic journal. They had a title, Antidepressants Do Not Work by Numbing Emotions, only to find a few weeks ago some of the same newspapers reporting actually they've now found that emotional blunting or numbing does occur even in healthy volunteers given antidepressants, which means it's impossible to blame on depression because these are healthy volunteers. I'll leave it there. That was just a roundup of the mixed bag of responses to our article. There's a few minutes for questions. Stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. That was brilliant. So yeah, there's a few questions in the Q&A box. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Do you want to maybe pick a couple? Or
Can I just quickly address the one on causation and correlation? So someone just asked about that because, and whoever asked was right. So there's a difference. So it may be that you find an abnormality of serotonin in people who are depressed, but that's, if you found that abnormality, it wouldn't necessarily show that the serotonin is causing the depression. It may be a correlation, or it may be the other way around even. It may be that the depression causes abnormalities in brain chemicals. The reason that I didn't mention it is because we found no association in the first place in our study of our review of serotonin studies in depression. We didn't really need to then get into the whole question of whether this was causation or correlation. But in principle, I think it is an important issue because, you know, there are studies showing that the brain does change in response to environmental insults, difficulties, stressful situations, etc. That does not mean that the brain is causing the emotional consequences of those. It means that what we're seeing is brain correlations of things that happen in people's lives and experiences that they have. Shall I have another go at?
Someone wants to know a bit more about the drug-centered versus disease-centered model, if you want to do that.
Yes, so I had to sort of skipped over that slide because I am aware that a lot of people have seen that slide very many times. Yes, so the disease-centered model is this idea that drugs work by targeting an underlying biological mechanism. And the drug-centered model is the idea that they work by changing the normal state of the brain and thereby changing normal mental activities and behaviors. And those changes are then superimposed onto what the individual is experiencing. So examples would be, you know, most medical drugs work by targeting mechanisms that produce symptoms, not necessarily the ultimate disease mechanism, but, you know, like your asthma inhaler targets the constriction of your of the airways in your lungs and therefore reduces wheezing. And most painkillers work by targeting the mechanisms that produce pain, even though they're clearly still symptomatic treatments. But the drug-centered model is more like the effects of alcohol, for example. If you drink a lot of alcohol, you will experience an altered mental state, your behavior will change, and you may temporarily forget about your sorrows. We have an expression, you know, drowning your sorrows in English. So that's, oh, thank you, I was putting that up. So that's what the drug-centered model is suggesting. And it's what I've tried to argue with the drug-centered model is not that using drugs for mental health problems is necessarily wrong or dangerous, but that we need to appreciate that we are changing the normal state of the brain when we do it. And that usually has unwanted consequences. And so we have to be very clear that the benefits of doing that outweigh the unwanted consequences. And I think there are some situations where the benefits of using drugs to temporarily reduce the intensity of feelings, emotions, or states of thinking, such as acute psychosis, for example, do outweigh the harmful consequences. But long-term use of any drugs is more problematic.
I think there's a question about just what you feel are the treatment options for depression that could be reliable. Just maybe.
Yes, I mean, I suppose the first thing is to make sure that you don't make things worse by taking a drug that is not going to do any good and that may well lead to long-term complications. And then the second thing is that there are many things that have been shown to be helpful that are simple things such as exercise, certain forms of therapy, but also I think that we have to look at, I think the way that we look at depression is wrong. I think if we look at it as a unified disease state that, that has a unified treatment, that's already a mistake. And that what we need to ask is why people are depressed and address the reasons why people are depressed. And obviously that will be different for each individual, for every individual. But having said that, as I said, there are probably some general things that people can do to help to help with their mood, such as exercise.
Maybe I'll answer Alex K's question at 3:51, and Joanna can chime in. So Alex K is saying, if everything we do, feel, think, the way we behave, etc., is mediated, not caused by biology, trying to avoid just crude biological reductionism, then why would it be bad science to hypothesize that, for example, adverse life events, especially during early childhood, when brain plasticity may be greater, can trigger biochemical changes, be it serotonergic or others? Is it therefore inconceivable that a psychoactive substance can have beneficial effects for some people, not inconsistent with the drug-centered model? So, I mean, I'll just say a couple of things about that, make some good points there. There is a lot of evidence that exposure to stressful life events or adverse life events predicts depression very strongly. So if you know the number of stressful life events, which include breaking up with a partner, losing a job, being diagnosed with a physical illness, the number of those in the preceding 12 months predicts very highly the risk of someone becoming depressed in the next 12 months. It's a straight line relationship. I've rarely seen such a strong relationship in research. It is mediated by people's personalities. They offer the most common construct they look at is neurosis, which roughly translates to sensitivity to stress. So the more neurotic you are, the more sensitive you are, the more likely you are to be depressed given the same number of stressful life events. And of course, in neurosis, there is personality and probably is some genetics and the influence of early childhood events. Probably early childhood events do have a stronger effect on people's trajectories and development than in adulthood when things are already set. And yes, I think this is what Alex is getting at. Of course, everything is biology. All our thoughts are biology. What we think, what we feel, being hungry, being tired, it's all essentially biology. So it's sort of a truism to say it's biology. And so could serotonin be involved in that or other transmitters? Almost certainly, because serotonin is probably involved in things all the way from mood to sleep to sexual activity, like many of the hundreds of thousands of interacting neurons and chemicals in our brain. But what is being talked about here with the chemical imbalance, with the traditional way this has been presented to the public and in medical training for many years, is that it's low serotonin. It's a particular reduction of a single chemical, not that it's involved in some poorly understood, highly complicated way, which may well be true. And so it's that simplistic idea that all of these complex events, depression, could be explained by a single chemical movement in a certain way. So it is conceivable that early life events could have changes later in life. And then the second part of the question, could a psychoactive substance have an effect? I think the way Joanna's outlined what medications do could be helpful, because they may dampen down negative emotions at times in people's lives when they're out of whack. But that's a very different explanation to being told that this drug will reverse an underlying chemical problem, which makes it sound very safe, very sensible to use long term, and in fact makes you think that doing other things doesn't make any sense, because if you've got a chemical problem that can be fixed by a drug, then why would you be looking elsewhere for other solutions?
I think that the bottom line is that, as we showed, there's no evidence that there is a serotonin abnormality in people with depression. That's one of the most heavily researched theories. So there's no convincing evidence that there's any other specific abnormality, whether those are caused by childhood maltreatment or stress or whatever, and therefore, because there's no evidence of that, giving an antidepressant is giving a chemical which is going to disrupt the brain, and which we have no idea whether it will have, whether there's any link between that and the biochemical mechanisms that produce mood states, if it really makes sense to talk about those.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it can kind of take people away from actually dealing with what is actually going on with mental ill health by taking a drug. Okay, so kind of we need to wrap up quite soon. Do you want to do maybe one more question from the Q&A?
Someone mentioned creative arts therapies as another therapeutic option. Yes, absolutely. I can slightly hear my colleagues on my back saying, oh, but these aren't evidence-based. They haven't been, demonstrated to work in randomized controlled trials. And again, I think that's one of the problems. We maybe need to think differently and stop, if we could stop thinking of this as a medical situation and use our common sense about how to deal with, how to help and support people who are struggling, who've been deeply affected by something, all the things that we could think up are probably going to be helpful.
Yeah, okay. All right, brilliant. So we'll take a break now, I think, and come back at 4:15 for the screening of the tapering antidepressant video. So yeah, thank you very much, Mark and Joanna. That was a really, really interesting talk. I'd just like to let everybody know that there's at 6:45 p.m. there'll be a separate Zoom meeting for the audience to have a discussion. Lucy's put some details in there in the chat. It's on a separate Zoom link. Okay, all right, well, thank you. And yeah, we'll see you in just over 10 minutes. Okay, thank you, bye.